It was a rainy Tuesday evening when Keanu Reeves, driving through a quiet street in the heart of the city, slowed down at a red light. His eyes fell upon an old, battered car parked under the flickering streetlight, its headlights dimming with the weight of the evening storm. There, in the front seat, sat a woman, her hands gripping the wheel with a look of desperation on her face. A small baby, no older than a year, slept in her lap. The sight was almost surreal against the backdrop of city lights, which normally buzzed with life, but tonight felt unusually hollow. Keanu's eyes lingered on them longer than usual, and something in his chest tightened. He could feel the weight of the moment, like a whisper, urging him to take action. He had seen his fair share of pain and suffering in his life, but this moment felt different. The way the woman gently stroked the baby's hair, as though trying to reassure the child that everything was okay, when clearly, it wasn't, it hit him harder than he expected. The realization crept in slowly, but he knew there was something he had to do. But what? The light turned green, and Keanu's foot hovered above the accelerator. He had the world at his feet, fame, wealth, and adoration from millions. But here, in this quiet corner of the city, was a woman and a child who had nothing, struggling to survive, clinging to the hope that somehow, someone might notice them. Keanu drove past the car, but his mind didn't leave the scene. His gaze remained fixed on the rearview mirror, the sight of the woman growing smaller and smaller until she disappeared. He pulled over, his hands gripping the steering wheel tightly. Was he doing enough? Was he ignoring what his heart screamed for him to do? His conscience gnawed at him, a feeling he couldn't shake off. He turned the car around. The streets were still wet from the rain, and the distant sound of cars passing by felt more distant now. As Keanu pulled back around the block, his car came to a halt right in front of the woman's vehicle. She looked up, startled at first, her eyes locking with his for a brief, fleeting moment. Keanu stepped out of the car, his heart pounding. "Hey," he called gently, not wanting to startle her further. "Are you okay?" The woman blinked, her eyes wide with disbelief. She was probably used to being ignored, maybe even dismissed by most people who saw her situation. But something in Keanu's voice was different. It wasn't just pity, it was genuine concern. The kind of concern that made you pause, reflect, and wonder if maybe, just maybe, there was still hope in the world. I'm fine," she stammered, wiping away a tear that had escaped from the corner of her eye. "Just trying to get by. My baby, she's only a few months old. We lost our apartment, and her voice faltered, and Keanu could see the weight of her words pressing down on her. The words hit him like a punch to the gut. Here she was, a mother doing everything she could, and yet she was slipping through the cracks of a system that was supposed to help people like her. Keanu's heart clenched. He had seen suffering before, but this was different. He paused for a moment, his eyes moving over her situation. The car, the small, worn-out blanket she had wrapped around the baby, the dirty windows. Keanu's mind raced with thoughts. He couldn't just stand here and do nothing. He couldn't. Without a second thought, he pulled his phone from his pocket and dialed a number. As the phone rang, he glanced at the woman, who was watching him with a mix of confusion and disbelief. When someone answered, he spoke quickly, but with purpose. "Hi, it's Keanu Reeves. I need help. A woman and her baby are living in a car near 5th and Maple. Can you arrange for immediate assistance, housing, food, whatever they need? Now." He hung up, turning back to the woman, who was now looking at him with a mix of awe and suspicion. She started, but he cut her off. "You're not alone," he said, his voice firm. "Someone will be here soon. They'll take care of you and your baby. Just hang on." She blinked, her lips trembling. She didn't know what to say. All she could do was nod, and for the first time in a long time, she allowed herself to believe that maybe, just maybe, someone out there cared. As Keanu turned to walk back to his car, his mind was already racing. He hadn't just done something kind, he had acted. But there was something else in his gut, something that whispered this was only the beginning of a much larger story, one that would unravel far beyond just this moment. Something told him that what had started with a simple act of kindness would soon challenge everything he thought he knew about society and himself. And in the back of his mind, a question lingered. What if this act of kindness would change his life in ways he couldn't yet understand? The following day, Keanu found himself unable to shake the memory of the homeless mother and her baby. As much as he tried to focus on his schedule, on the upcoming projects, and the buzz of his usual routine, something deep inside him pulled him back to that moment. It was almost as though the encounter had left an imprint on him, one he couldn't ignore. He had helped them, yes, but in his mind, that wasn't enough. Something still wasn't right. There was a larger story here, a much deeper issue than just one woman and her child. That evening, Keanu found himself walking the city streets, the cool air biting at his skin as he passed by familiar, wealthy buildings. Everything felt off. The world seemed disconnected. There were people here, people everywhere, living lives that seemed unbothered by the very same problems that plagued the woman he had helped. It was like two separate worlds existed in parallel, only a thin line of privilege separating them. His thoughts kept returning to her, the homeless mother. Who was she? How did she end up in this situation? What had happened to her? Keanu's curiosity shifted into something more powerful, a desire to understand, to uncover the truth behind the situation. He wanted to know how society allowed this to happen, how something as basic as shelter could slip through the cracks for so many. He couldn't ignore the nagging feeling that there was more to it than just bad luck or unfortunate circumstances. Keanu pulled out his phone and sent a message to the number he had called the previous night. "I need to meet the woman. I need to know her story." The response came back almost instantly. "We're working on it. Someone will reach out to you soon." But Keanu didn't want to wait. He wasn't the type to sit back and hope for answers. He needed to act now. Within an hour, he was back at the same intersection, scanning the street as if he could will her to appear. And then, there she was, standing in front of the same battered car, the baby in her arms. She looked different today, though, more guarded, almost like she expected something, though she hadn't seen him yet. Keanu approached slowly, his footsteps deliberate. He wasn't sure why he felt so driven to know her, but the urge was undeniable. He stepped up to her, his eyes warm but filled with an intensity that she probably didn't expect. "Hey," he greeted, trying to sound casual. "I've been thinking about you. And your story. Can we talk?" She looked up at him, her eyes wide but weary. She clearly hadn't expected him to return, let alone show interest in anything beyond a quick charity gesture. But she hesitated before nodding, her gaze flicking toward her baby, as if checking for reassurance before responding. "I didn't think anyone would care," she murmured. "But, yeah, we can talk." They sat down on a nearby bench, the rain from earlier still fresh in the air, creating a cool mist around them. The city buzzed in the background, but it felt oddly distant, as though they were in their own little world for the moment. Her name was Sarah. She told him she had once been part of a thriving family business, one that had collapsed overnight when the financial crash hit. The business she had worked so hard to build, along with her husband, was gone in a matter of months. Her husband, unable to cope with the loss, had turned to alcohol, and eventually, he was gone too, leaving her alone with their child, and with no place to turn. Keanu listened intently, his mind working through the details. It was a familiar story, but hearing it from her made it more real, more painful. Sarah didn't ask for help. She didn't plead for sympathy. She just told her truth, quietly, almost as if she had resigned herself to her fate. The rawness in her voice struck something deep within him, a realization of how fragile success really was, and how easily it could slip through someone's fingers. "But why hasn't anyone helped you?" Keanu asked, leaning forward. "I mean, why is this happening? Why is no one doing anything?" Her eyes welled up, but she quickly wiped away the tear that slipped down her cheek. "I don't know. I've tried. I've gone to shelters, to welfare offices. They turn you away if you don't have the right paperwork, or if you don't fit into some category. I've heard it all. I guess I just gave up trying." Keanu's fists clenched at the injustice of it all. The system that was supposed to help people like her was failing. He had seen it firsthand, but hearing it from Sarah made the reality of it undeniable. The fact that people were falling through the cracks, the fact that she was being overlooked, hurt more than he could express. Keanu stood up, his resolve strengthening with every word she said. He couldn't just leave it at this. He had to make a change. Not just for Sarah, but for everyone like her who had been let down by a broken system. The world couldn't stay the way it was. Not anymore. "I'm going to do something about this," he said, more to himself than to her. "I don't know how, but I will. This can't keep happening." Sarah looked up at him, a faint smile pulling at the corner of her lips. "You're just one person. How can you change all of this?" Keanu met her gaze, his eyes steady. "One person is enough, Sarah. One person can change everything." In that moment, Keanu understood that the story was no longer just about a homeless woman and her baby, it was about a much larger battle. A battle against a system that kept people like Sarah trapped in a cycle of hopelessness. And Keanu Reeves, the man who had always been known for his kindness and humility, was about to become more than just an actor. He was about to become a symbol for change. The days that followed were a blur of meetings, phone calls, and a whirlwind of actions Keanu hadn't expected. What began as a single act of kindness to help a woman in need had now spiraled into something much bigger. It wasn't just about giving Sarah a temporary solution, it was about challenging a system that failed so many people like her. Keanu was determined to shine a light on the flaws that went unnoticed by the masses, flaws that allowed individuals to fall through the cracks without anyone even blinking an eye. But his efforts weren't without resistance. The more Keanu dug into the issue, the more he discovered how deep the corruption ran. He reached out to local charities, government programs, and even social services, hoping to find a way to help Sarah and others in her position. But everywhere he turned, there was a wall of bureaucracy, indifference, and red tape. The more he exposed, the more the system seemed to fight back. At one point, Keanu received a call from a high-ranking official who, with an air of frustration, warned him to stop digging. "Keanu, you're stirring up trouble you don't understand. These things are more complicated than you think. You can't fix this with a few headlines or a donation." Keanu, however, wasn't one to back down. "Maybe I can't fix it all, but I'll be damned if I'll sit here and watch it continue. People are suffering, and I won't stop until I've done what I can." The more he exposed, the more the world began to take notice. People started following his every move, intrigued by his sudden involvement in social justice. But Keanu wasn't doing it for fame or recognition, he was doing it because he couldn't unsee the pain, the brokenness, and the raw humanity of it all. As the media attention grew, so did the controversy. People began questioning his motives. Was he genuinely interested in helping, or was this all just another publicity stunt? Some even accused him of exploiting the very people he claimed to be helping, using their stories as a way to gain more attention. Keanu didn't let the criticism faze him. He knew why he was doing this. It wasn't about the spotlight, it was about righting a wrong. But the more he continued to push, the more he realized how much he had underestimated the power of the system he was fighting. It wasn't just about helping individuals, it was about challenging the way society viewed the less fortunate. One evening, as Keanu sat in his office, poring over documents, he received a call that would change everything. It was from Sarah. Her voice trembled as she spoke. "Keanu, I don't know who else to turn to. They've taken my baby." The words hit him like a slap to the face. "What do you mean? What's happened?" "They said I'm unfit, that I'm not able to care for her. They've taken her into foster care. I don't know what to do. Please, help me." Keanu's heart sank. This was worse than anything he had imagined. In his quest to fix a broken system, he had never prepared himself for the personal cost of it all. The idea that Sarah, who had already lost everything, could now lose the one thing she had left, the love for her child, was beyond devastating. Without hesitation, Keanu sprang into action. He called his legal team, reached out to child advocacy organizations, and even contacted local activists who had been fighting against child welfare corruption. But time was not on their side. The system, once again, was set in motion, and it seemed almost impossible to stop. As Keanu made his way to the courtroom, he couldn't help but wonder if this was the tipping point, the moment where his fight for change would become personal. It wasn't just about Sarah anymore. It was about standing up for the voiceless, the marginalized, the forgotten. It was about showing the world that the fight for justice wasn't just a fleeting moment, it was a movement. The courtroom was tense as Sarah stood at the front, facing the judge, who seemed to look at her with disdain, as though her situation was the result of her own mistakes. Keanu, standing in the back, felt an intense surge of anger rise within him. He had seen injustice in films, on the screen, but this was real. This was happening right in front of him. When the judge finally spoke, his words were cold and final. The child will remain in state custody. The mother has failed to prove she can provide a stable environment. Keanu's heart dropped. It was over, or so it seemed, but as he watched Sarah's eyes fill with tears, something within him snapped. He couldn't let this happen. Not when he had the power to do something about it. With a sudden determination, Keanu stood up. The entire room turned to look at him, shocked by his unexpected interruption. "Your Honor," he said, his voice steady but filled with urgency. "I'm Keanu Reeves. I want to take responsibility for this child. I'll provide a stable home. I'll ensure she has everything she needs. But please, don't let her stay in the system. Not like this." There was a stunned silence. No one had expected this. The judge glanced at the opposing lawyer, who seemed just as surprised, before nodding slowly. "Mr. Reeves, this is highly unconventional. But I'll consider your request." Keanu felt a rush of relief mixed with uncertainty. He didn't know what would happen next, but he had done what he could. The fight wasn't over yet, but it had just taken a new turn. Now, not only was he challenging the system for Sarah, but he was also taking on a much larger, much more personal fight. And as he left the courtroom, he couldn't help but wonder, was he ready for the consequences of this choice? Would this act of kindness cost him more than he could afford? Days passed in a blur of uncertainty, but Keanu's determination never wavered. The court proceedings were far from over, and each twist in the journey brought new challenges. Yet, he never lost sight of what mattered: Sarah's child, her future, and the fight for a broken system that didn't seem to care. Finally, after weeks of legal battles, tense negotiations, and public outcry, the judge made a decision that would change everything. Keanu's offer to take custody of the child was accepted, but it came with conditions. There would be visits, assessments, and strict scrutiny. Still, it was a win. Sarah's daughter would be safe, and for the first time in a long while, Sarah found a glimmer of hope. Keanu knew that this was just the beginning. The issues at hand were too deep to be solved with one court case. But what this moment proved was that even one person could make a difference. It proved that kindness, when backed by action, could bring about real change. As Keanu stood outside the courthouse, Sarah by his side, holding her daughter tightly in her arms, a quiet peace settled over him. The battle was far from over, but in this small victory, he knew he had done the right thing. He had fought for what was right, even when the odds were stacked against him. And as they walked away, side by side, Keanu couldn't help but feel that in this fight, he had found something even more valuable than the success he had always known. He had found his true purpose. The world might be broken, but as long as there were people willing to stand up, to fight for those who couldn't fight for themselves, there was still hope. And Keanu Reeves, a man once known for his roles on screen, had just become the hero of a real-life story that would leave a legacy far greater than any movie ever could. The end was just the beginning.